Good afternoon and welcome to the talk that we're going to have on sports and exercise. I'm just going to leave it another couple of minutes to let other people come in. So make yourselves comfortable and we'll start in just a couple of minutes. People are slowly joining us, so we'll wait for the numbers to go up just a little bit more. We know we've got most of the people in and then we'll get started. Okay, we seem to be levelling off here. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Emma. I have a 12-year-old type 1 diabetic son. He's been diagnosed for 6 years. Been at the conference every year since and absolutely love it. One of the reasons I love it is talks like this. We've got Dr. Alistair Lumb with us this afternoon, who's going to be speaking to us about sports and exercise with type 1 diabetes. So what we're going to do, we're going to listen to the talk. If anyone has any questions at all, please do use the chat function. You can see the button at the bottom of the screen and type in any questions, introduce yourselves, type in any questions. And there's also a question and answers there as well. So actually questions go there, chat in the other area. And what we'll do, if there's anything sort of glaringly needs to be answered during the course, I'll drop it in and I'll speak to Dr. Lumb and ask him to respond there. Any other questions we'll try and do at the end, but please enjoy the session. Another quick note before we get started, that we're very lucky to have a number of sponsors who have been who are sponsoring the conference, enabling it to go ahead. So do go and visit the sponsor section, sponsor booths on the website, and you can find out a little bit more about what they're currently offering as well. All right, so I'm going to pass across to Alistair, and so enjoy the session, and as I say, please introduce yourselves in the chat and drop any questions in, and we'll get those we'll put those to Alistair during the session. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Emma. It's a real honour to be asked to present this session. So what I'm going to do is just share some slides with you, which hopefully you can all see now. As Emma said, my name's Alistair Lumb. I'm a consultant in diabetes in Oxford. I don't live with type 1 myself. And I got interested in sport and exercise and type 1 because I'm a sports fan as much as anything, to be honest. And during my training, I'm sort of very lucky, happened to go and work for a man called Ian Gallen, who worked in High Wycombe, which was part of where I was training around Oxford. And he looked after Sir Steve Redgrave when he developed diabetes before his final Olympics. So I kind of fell into doing this by accident, but it's something I've really enjoyed, and I've learned a huge amount from people with type 1. So what I'm going to present today is sort of some of it is about the science, and some of it is hopefully some practical tips, and a lot of it is stuff that I've really learned from the people that I've worked with. So I'm going to sort of cover a couple of different things. One, and I know you guys know this already, but I think it's worth thinking about why exercise in type 1 is a challenge, and what are the things that make it a challenge, and then what is the ICE in the title of my talk for. So we will come back to the concept of ICE. So challenges, and I think this is worth thinking about because this is true for the general population, but it's also true for people with type 1. Actually, you know, I'm not a paediatrician. I work with our paediatric colleagues and do a sports clinic for children and young people with type 1 under their supervision. But most of my work's with adults. And actually, if we look at adults with type 1, and this is similar in the general population, majority don't achieve recommended levels of physical activity. More than half are above recommended body weight. Many of others actually have high cholesterol and high blood pressure. And there are real benefits to health benefits to exercise for the general population. And you can see how those might be particularly helpful for people with type 1. So you get improvements in lots of health markers, and that's things like blood pressure and cholesterol and body weight and things like that. In the context of type 1, being more active is associated with a lower risk of developing complications, so it can be helpful that way. And there is some evidence of an improvement in life expectancy as well. So that is, another real positive. Thinking about the barriers, and this is actually based on some questionnaire work that's been done, and this is taken from a couple of different questionnaires actually, about what are the barriers to exercise in type 1 diabetes. And the big one, the one that always comes out on top, is fear of hypos. But big concerns for people living with type 1 are also sort of losing the kind of control that people normally have of their blood glucose and their ability to manage it, and actually not knowing what to do. And a lot of that has been around healthcare professionals not knowing what to do around exercise management. And I can remember going back a few years, I saw a woman in clinic who recently moved into the area where I was working. And her week was she had netball training on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. She played a netball match on Saturday. She might go to the gym once or twice a week. And on Sunday, she'd often go for a bike ride and a pub lunch with her other half. Now that sounds to me like, one, a normal week, and two, a pretty healthy week. And actually she'd been told, rather embarrassingly, as a healthcare professional by her previous centre, that she was doing too much exercise. And the reason she'd been told she was doing too much exercise, I think, was because they didn't have the confidence to know what to do to help her manage it. And I think, there's programs going on, and I'm lucky to work with some really good healthcare professionals. So a particular mention to Professor Rob Andrews from Exeter and Bristol and Taunton, and Professor Dr. Parth Narendran from Birmingham, who've developed a kind of training course built to XTOD, so that's exercise in type 1 diabetes. And that training course has been for healthcare professionals, so trying to share the knowledge that there is around this area, and also creating a sort of Daphne style training course for people with type 1 themselves, so that people can kind of pick up this appropriate knowledge. And of course, now with the advent of the diabetes online community, there's a lot of this information being shared by the experts through experience, the people with type 1 themselves who really know a lot about this. So those are big things for people with type 1. The other things that you see listed along there are the kind of things that people without type 1 like me. The irony of the fact that I've probably got about 500 steps on my step count today, because I was on call yesterday, was at work until 11 o'clock, and I've spent today putting these slides together. Anyway, we'll gloss over that. Fine. So different kinds of activity, and I think it's really important that we recognise that exercise is not just exercise, that there are different kinds of activity. And actually you can think about 3 types of activity. So what do we need to be good at kind of sports, or the kind of exercise that we're doing? We need 3 things in different combinations. So we need sort of an element of flexibility and suppleness, and that will normally come from flexibility or stretching exercise, which doesn't have much of an impact on blood glucose. We need some endurance, which tends to come from aerobic activity, and some power, which comes from anaerobic activity. So that's how we build up strength and power. So I'm going to talk about 3 slightly different types of activity to those, but you can think about, those are the things you need to be good. So actually the flexibility and stretching doesn't have much of an impact on blood glucose. So we'll talk about the aerobic, the anaerobic, and then a mixture of those 2. So aerobic activity, this is the stuff that gives us our endurance, lower intensity, longer duration. So stuff we can keep going for at least kind of half an hour to an hour, maybe longer. If you don't have diabetes during this kind of activity, body makes less insulin. It makes less insulin, so you can produce some energy from your energy stores. It also makes more of some other hormones, so you get a slight rise in things like adrenaline and other hormones as well. And all of that combines to help you make energy from your energy stores, and that's both fat stores and carbohydrate stores. And that means that blood glucose will stay fairly steady if you don't have diabetes. For someone with diabetes, there's a couple of different things that really combine. One is the amount of insulin when you're not being active is normally more than you need when you are being active. So the amount of insulin around is normally a little bit more than you need. So that can predispose to hypos. And also, when you inject insulin or you infuse it via a pump, then that insulin sort of gets to the muscles more quickly than it gets to the liver and the other kind of organs inside. And those things kind of mean that you've got maybe a bit more insulin and it's driving glucose into the muscles a bit more than it would be if your own body was making it. So the main problem is hypos. And this is what we're really familiar with in terms of activity. For anaerobic activity, this is kind of high intensity, shorter duration. Actually, I'm going to flip back. Sorry, the photographs that are used here. So this is a guy called Andreas Petz, who I was lucky enough to meet when we were writing some international guidelines on managing exercise for type 1. So Andreas and this is him as an Ironman triathlete. So living with type 1, but managing his type 1 through an Ironman triathlon. This photo is of Mandy Marquardt. I don't know if any of you come across Mandy. She's on social media, but she is a sprint cyclist. So her kind of sprints are kind of between 500 meters and 2 kilometers. So this is kind of really high intensity. Doesn't last very long because you can't work that hard for extended periods of time. It's just not possible. You know, we all know that kind of build-up of the lactic acid giving us a stitch and that horrible pain that you get, and you know, the muscles working so hard that you get to a point where you can't work anymore. So this is the kind of high intensity sprint type stuff. And our bodies respond to this in different ways because you need a lot of energy really quickly for this. You can't produce energy from fat quickly enough. So your body kicks out a whole load of adrenaline-like hormones. They're called catecholamines. And the levels of those rise to around 15 times what they are normally. And that then drives an increase in glucose production in the body to 7 or 8 times its normal rate. And even in young, lean, fit men, is where the study was done, that can cause a rise of about 2 millimoles per litre in terms of blood glucose. So that's people who have no problem with their pancreas at all, okay? And so you can see how in the context of type 1, you can get high glucose with this kind of activity. So the third type of activity I want to talk about is intermittent high intensity. As you hopefully will recognise Henry Slade here, who plays rugby for England and lives with type 1 and has been very public about that. So intermittent high intensity activity is, as it says there, characteristic of most of the team sports that we'll see and also the way children play. And it's a bit like I would say, I don't think you get it anymore on Sky Sports, but you used to be able to have player cam on Sky Sports. So you could just focus on one player and what they were doing. And if you did that, what you see is players sprinting for short periods of time and then doing much less intensive activity while they're watching what's going on in the game. They're positioning themselves for their team and things like that. So what that is a mixture of the other two types of activity. So the high intensity and the anaerobic and the aerobic or moderate intensity. Now, what that means is generally the balance is that the glucose may stay reasonably steady or will drop a little bit, but not drop as fast as if you were just doing steady activity. But actually, the glucose can go either way. And that depends on a number of factors. It depends on what position you're playing. So, you know, position you're playing, you might have a bit of influence over. but it also depends on how good the opposition are as well. So if the opposition are much better, you're likely to be working much harder and probably more high intensity. If it's an easier game, there's more moderate intensity. So you can see, depending on, you know, who's on the other end of the pitch, or if you're playing tennis, say, who's on the other side of the net, you know, that can have an influence on what happens with blood glucose. And that's, you know, one of the other challenges of exercise in type 1, when you know, there are things out of your control. So this is just a summary of that, really. And I just want to draw your attention to these little graphs at the bottom of the screen. So, you know, what you see for people where it says control, so that's people without type 1, glucose will tend to stay fairly steady whatever we do, because the body will, you know, is incredibly clever at regulating the energy production and balancing it with our energy usage. But you do see with that anaerobic, with that high intensity stuff, you do get that blip in blood glucose, which, you know, happens in people without type 1 diabetes. And I think just knowing that is quite interesting. And the other thing is, for the other types of activity, so if we look at type 1, the aerobic, we tend to see the drop. For the anaerobic, we tend to see the rise. And for the other types of activity, it kind of depends on how much of those two there is, just as a summary. So there's a couple of other things that I think are quite useful to think about in terms of the impact of exercise and activity on people with type 1. And this is looking at, so there's various reasons why it happens, but the main thing is insulin. We know insulin helps glucose get into cells. I think we're all familiar with that concept that, you know, to get glucose into the cells, into the muscle, insulin helps with that. And the way it helps with that is bringing little receptors up to the surface of the cell, and they pull the glucose in, and they're called GLUT4 receptors. Don't worry, this isn't a test. The interesting thing is, if you contract a skeletal muscle, so if I move my arm like this, by doing this kind of activity, I'm bringing those same receptors up to the cell surface. Okay, so it means that just by doing that, I will move more glucose into my cells. Okay, so what that means is, by doing the activity, we become more sensitive to insulin. And that has an impact on how, you know, then is worth thinking about how often we exercise and what impact that has on our glucose. So let's take this. So this is a normal day, normal insulin requirement. And we can see that the insulin requirement is kind of lowest in the morning, then increases with 3 meals in the day, and then drifts down during the night. Then the following morning rises up again. Okay, so this is just looking at a normal day-to-day insulin requirement. So what's the effect on that of training? Well, so this green line, you can see on day 1 that the insulin requirement goes down, and then day 2, probably coming back, it's kind of fairly closely matched to a normal day, but actually it isn't exactly the same. And then on day 3, it's probably back to if we hadn't been active. Then if you exercise again on day 4, it all changes again. So what that means is, if you are active intermittently, it actually has a kind of bigger impact on changes in insulin requirement. So what about if we exercise every day? And actually, what you can see is, it's actually helpful to be active as frequently as we can be, because that makes things more consistent. So things are changing less from day to day. And I think, you know, in terms of things we can do to reduce the challenge, that's one that is definitely worth thinking about. Now, you know, it's a different challenge for different people. You know, a lot of the kids that I see, for example, a lot of the adults I see are doing this kind of pattern, and it's about managing within that. And I realize it's not realistic for everybody, but if we're able to be active on a regular basis, it actually helps to regulate things. A couple of other things that I think it's worth thinking about. One is low glucose after exercise, and I think this is probably again something that's quite familiar. It's a very well recognised problem, and it comes from a number of different factors. So we've seen already that activity makes you more sensitive to insulin. You also need to, you spend your energy stores, so you need to refill them. And actually, if people have a hypo, you know, that kind of shaking, the sweating and all the rest of it, that comes from a hormone response to that hypo. That's the adrenaline kicking in to bring the glucose back up. And that hormone response that you get to a hypo isn't as strong if you've been exercising. So you can see there's a combination of different things that make low glucose after exercise more likely. So thinking about glucose targets, best performance is probably somewhere around 7 to 10 millimoles per litre. So that's our general target for exercise. Now, being a bit lower than that probably isn't a problem, actually. You just worry a little bit about going too much lower than that. Being higher than that, then you start, actually the body starts to change the way it burns fuel, and so changes our efficiency and can have impacts on performance as well, and we do see that. Of course, it's easy for me to blithely sit here and say exercise between 7 and 10. I get that that's easier said than done. It's a range because we know you're never going to hit a particular number, but actually even hitting a tight range like that is a challenge. This, I think, isn't something I like to say, and you'll see that at the end. But I think there are some times where it's worth thinking, is exercise the right thing to do right now? Okay, so we've been thinking in threes already. We've thought, you know, we've thought about 3 different types of exercise. Think about 3. So stick the number 3 in your mind. I'm going to come back to it a couple of times again. 3 times where it's probably not entirely safe to be exercising. Okay. So one is if your blood glucose now is less than 3.5. Okay. If you're using a sensor, check that with a finger stick. But if your blood glucose now is less than 3.5, bring it back up above 3.5 before starting to exercise. If you've had a severe hypo in the last 24 hours, so that's not, you know, you can to a certain extent judge severe for yourself, but the kind of accepted definition of this is needed help to treat it. So you wouldn't have been able to treat it without help. That has a real impact. It really drains energy stores, which need a lot of replenishment. It has a real impact on the body's ability to, hormone responses to activity and hypos and things like that. And actually, Rob Andrews, who I spoke about before, has worked with the London Marathon, and people who've had severe hypos the night before the marathon who are living with type 1 generally haven't managed to complete it. It's had a big impact on their ability to do things. So it's really worth thinking about whether it's the right thing to do. The third, and I think again, this is probably something that we'll have some awareness of, is if glucose is high, and here we're talking about above 15, and the ketone level is elevated, so ketones above 1.5. So that's implying maybe there isn't enough insulin around. And then by being active, exercising in that kind of, the way the body is, then there isn't quite enough insulin around. Exercise does stimulate other kinds of hormones to be produced, so the adrenaline-like hormones and other things, and that can actually tip towards ketoacidosis. So the thing is, manage that first. Okay, so I've given you a whole load of problems. Which is lovely, isn't it? But let's talk about some solutions. So ice, what do we mean by ice? So these are the 3 things that it's worth thinking about. So that's insulin, carbohydrate, and exercise, okay? And these are the 3 things that we can use to help us manage. When can we do that? Well, again, there's 3 basic times that we can think about where we can adjust the insulin, we can adjust the carbs, and we can adjust the exercise. So that's before the activity, during the activity and after the activity. So let's think about the insulin side of things. I'm going to really whip through some kind of key advice here. Now, I'm happy to pick up. I thought in half an hour, it's better that you had some little tidbits on everything rather than I did anything in great detail. So I'm going to whip through some key bits of advice. So what do we do beforehand with insulin? So I'm starting with the eye of ice, and we're going to do before, during, and after for each of them. So insulin, once you're exercising, changing insulin, because insulin, adjustments in insulin will have an effect pretty slowly, and that's influences some of these timescales here. So the before is really before and during. So let's think about it. If it's a type of activity we're expecting glucose to fall, how could if glucose is going to fall, then we probably ideally want less insulin around. So what kind of factors are we going to think about? So starting point, and remember, all of this is a starting point. Actually, if there was someone that all of this advice worked perfectly for, that'd be great. But I think every single person with diabetes needs to adjust this advice a little bit. The other thing is, sometimes insulin's the right thing to adjust, sometimes carbs is the right thing to adjust, sometimes activity is the right thing. And again, people can decide what's the best thing for them. I work with a dietitian called Anne-Marie, who's one of our paediatric dietitians in Oxford. He describes it very nicely as these as tools in a toolbox, and you don't have to use all of the tools at the same time, and different tools will be the right thing to help you in different situations. So if we're going back to insulin, if we've got activity, we're expecting glucose to fall. So actually, if glucose is going to fall, then maybe we want a little bit less insulin around. So there's a couple of things we can try. We can try reducing our bolus, and by 50%. So 50% is the starting point, okay? And I think the key thing is it's probably a bit more than you think. So if you're having food within 90 minutes beforehand, and that's trying to take into account where the peak of the insulin action will be. Having food within 90 minutes beforehand, then think about reducing the bolus, and starting point of 50%, okay? And now, that may take us out of that 7 to 10 range, so we might need to adjust it a bit, but that's a place to start. The other way we can reduce insulin is if you're on a pump. So we generally wouldn't reduce basal insulin beforehand if we're on injections, but if you're on a pump, then ideally reducing the basal about 90 minutes to 2 hours beforehand, and use a -50% to -80% temporary basal rate, okay? Now, the reason it's that much of a reduction and the reason it's that long beforehand is insulin doesn't fall as quickly as you think it does, okay? So we think if we do a -50% temporary basal rate in, an hour's time, the amount of insulin in the bloodstream will be half of what it would have been. And actually that's not true. At 2 hours, it's 80% of what it would have been. So it doesn't fall as much. And that's why those basal reductions need to be done early and are probably a bit more than you'd expect. The other thing to think about is if you're doing high intensity activity where the glucose can rise, you can either do no changes beforehand. If you're absolutely confident that the glucose is going to rise, then you can even think about adding in a little bit of extra insulin beforehand. If we're going to do how much extra insulin beforehand, we'll come on to that in a second. So what about afterwards? What can we do? So if you've reduced the basal, actually the evidence we have so far says return it to normal at the end of the exercise. Because of that increased sensitivity to insulin, some people need to keep the reduction going. But actually the evidence that we have suggests reducing, you can go back to normal at the end of the exercise. The other thing is, if you're exercising either in the afternoon, so after around 4 p.m, or you're doing something that's particularly heavy exercise or particularly unfamiliar, you know, something, you know, kind of training that you've not done before that you're really unfamiliar with, you're likely to burn more fuel and you're going to need to replenish more. So with that high pose overnight that we talked about before, there's a couple of solutions. If you're on a pump, reducing the basal by 20% between 4 and 6 hours from bedtime can be really helpful, and the closed loop systems will do that. If you're on injections and you're giving an evening dose, then it's worth thinking about reducing that evening dose by between 10 and 20%. It's less useful if you're on Tresiba for obvious reasons. Carbs. Now, I know John Pemberton is here and involved in this conference, and so even opening my mouth to talk about carbs is a little bit embarrassing, but I'm going to do it anyway. So beforehand, where possible, think about, you know, a starchy, low glycemic index carbohydrate meal at least 2 hours before, and then you can use normal insulin doses and don't have to make big adjustments. Adding some protein can be helpful, and that's partly about keeping up overall protein intake to help with muscle building and things like that, and partly actually because of the impact on the glycemic index of the food. So the other thing to do before is to make sure that you stay well hydrated. And that's partly because activity is going to dehydrate you, and partly because actually being well hydrated, you know, it's one of the protections that we've got against the high glucose. Anne-Marie, who I was talking about before, talks about it. So it's a bit like Ribena, okay? So if you've got a certain amount of, you know, you've got your a certain amount of sugar in your bloodstream, if you don't add much water to that, so you're dehydrated, it's more concentrated. So on average, your blood glucose will be higher. Whereas if you're well hydrated and you've drunk plenty, that Ribena is more diluted, and so your blood glucose will be lower. I'm not going to walk through this in great detail, but this is just a flow chart that you can use for carb replacement immediately before the activity. So if you're in the, I mean, they use the range 7 to 15. If you're in, I still would say aim for 7 to 10. If you're less than 7, add some extra carbohydrate, say between 3.5 and 7. It's either 15 or 20 grams of carbs. If you're less than 3.5, 20 grams of carbs, and make sure you come up, bring the glucose up, and then wait for 45 minutes. Similar actually to the advice would be for driving as well. If you're more than 15, then if the ketones are okay, then you can either use a small correction dose, or actually the aerobic activity can help to bring the glucose back down, and it might be one way of doing it. But definitely use a correction dose if your ketones are elevated. And the other thing to think about is changing, you know, sort of moving yourself either left or right. If for people who are using sensors, so Libre or Dexcom or Medtronic sensors, if you've got an upward arrow, then you can kind of move yourself into the next column. So if you're between 5.7 and 6.9, but you've got an upward arrow, then actually you might not need extra carbs beforehand. Whereas if you've got a downward arrow, you might need a bit more in the way of carbs beforehand. Fine. Carb replacement during activity, there are various different ways of working this out. The one that I find quite useful and is relatively simple, although probably does overestimate a little bit, is maybe 0.5 gram per kilo of body weight per hour of exercise. So if you weigh 60 kilograms, that's 30 grams for an hour, and ideally take it about every 20 minutes. So rather than getting a big rise and then a drop, what you do is get little rises, and you know, you get a little wave and you stay within that target range. If you're using a sensor, you can then adjust that a little bit more. So this is a kind of rule of thumb, but it allows us to adjust. So if that's an overestimate for us in the situation that we're in at that time, yes, if you've got a flat arrow, then keep doing the same thing, replace every 10 20 minutes. And for our 60 kilogram person, that's 10 gram every 20 minutes. Maybe if you've got a kind of slow rise, then maybe halve that. So for our 60 kilogram person, it's 5 grams every 20 minutes. If you've got a rapidly rising glucose, then have no carbs and recheck in 20 minutes. And then we increase. So if we've got a sort of slow decrease, maybe 1.5 times. And if we've got a rapid decrease, twice. And we're looking at that every 20 minutes. So for a slow decrease for our 60 kilogram person, that's 15 grams. For a rapid decrease, that's 20 grams every 20 minutes. This is from a trial that Mike Riddell and his group did in Canada, which was done in a sports camp for young people with type 1 diabetes. And it was essentially, if the sense glucose was less than 7 during activity and dropping, take action. Really simple protocol, and you can see it even says 16, 20, 16, 8, so multiples of 4 grams of carbohydrate. What they were doing was basically giving different amounts of different numbers of glucose tablets with 4 grams in each glucose tablet. And actually, and I'm very happy to share these slides, what this pretty much eliminated hypos in a sports camp for children and young people with type 1. Carbs afterwards, ideally have some carbs within 1 to 2 hours afterwards. If you're eating a full meal, just make sure it's got some carbs, at least 1 gram per kilo, and some protein. And then we've talked about maybe thinking about reducing the insulin afterwards as well by 50%. If you're not eating a meal, then having a snack without insulin and some protein can be really helpful. And the kind of some good advice. Oh, sorry, I think I've skipped over one. Yeah, some golden hour snack ideas. Milkshakes are quite useful because they're quite popular. They've got protein, carbs, but there's a whole range of different things. With Anne-Marie helped draw up these slides, and that peanut, she's always going to have something with peanut butter in it on there. So for the last bit, and I'm aware of time, we can use exercise to as part of our solution as well. So this is people going into the gym. So it's the same people on 2 different days using CGM data, going into the gym on 2 different days. And you know, if you join a gym, you get given some cardio and some weights sort of exercises to do. So the cardio is the aerobic and the weights is the anaerobic. Or resistance exercise. So what you see is the solid line with the closed circles. People went into the gym in the morning and did their weights first and then did their cardio. And with the open circles, the dotted line, they did their cardio first and then their weights. And what you see is glucose-wise, they start and finish in about the same place, but they have different journeys. So if you go into the gym and your glucose is a bit higher than you'd like, do the cardio first. If you go into the gym and the glucose is a bit lower than you'd like, do the weights first. And actually, you can help manage things just by using the type of activity. And kind of things you can do. So before and after certainly is low intensity warm up and warm down can be really helpful for managing glucose before and after exercise. And we've found this really useful. For example, on match days, that low intensity warm up, you get that adrenaline high on a match morning or a race day, and it can be something that's really helpful to manage that glucose down. You can also flip that around, and so a 10-second sprint, that's full out 10-second sprint, can help to bring glucose up during activity, but also before and afterwards as well. Now, it's important to remember that isn't a hypo treatment. So if you're hypo, treat the hypo with glucose. This isn't a way of managing that. It's just if you're trending in the wrong direction, then you can bring it up. And the other thing to remember is that's coming out of energy stores and it's going to have to be paid back later. So hopefully that's given you some things to think about. Just very quickly, just wanted to point to some things that people can achieve with type 1. So I think Sir Steve Redgrave, his achievements are well documented. Roddy Riddle in the top right, some of you may well know and know of. That's Roddy at the end of the Marathon des Sables, so 5 marathons in 6 days in the Sahara Desert. And bottom right is Sam Brand from the Team Novo Nordisk team. And that's winning a stage of a professional bike race. So finish with a sunny picture of Oxford. I'm very happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Alistair. Sorry, I was muted there, chatting away. That was fantastic. And yes, that is you in Oxford. I didn't even give an introduction, proper introduction for you, did I, Alistair? I'm so sorry.
No, that's fine.
Consultant in Oxford, and clearly a lot of experience of working with people in sport. So your esteemed advice is, I can tell from the questions, is gratefully received here. We have a number of questions which are fantastic, actually. So let me just kick off with them. One of the questions relates to, on your slides, you mentioned that if you have a hypo that you need to treat, that you shouldn't then exercise for 45 minutes. And certainly some of the audience said that actually, if you've got a keen kid who's really into his football, I mean, I can barely get mine off to have dextrose, let alone you know, sit him down for 45 minutes. That's really hard. Is that a have to, or
it's not have to? No, I think we have to be realistic here, and as I said, I'm not keen to say no to any person with diabetes, and particularly young people with diabetes. We want to encourage them. I think equally, as long as we know that we've given them adequate carbs and can kind of recheck within a reasonable time frame, and for example, if we're using a sensor, can see the glucose going in the right direction, ideally, then no, 45 minutes isn't an absolute have to. I think that's an ideal. And of course, if you've got a race in 20 minutes, you're not gonna not do the race. You know, I think the other thing to be aware with, if you've had a hypo, is, again, as I was saying, it eats into your energy stores as well. So you just might need, if you use a certain amount of carb replacement, you might need a bit more.
Yeah, that's good advice. I remember watching a YouTube video Henry Slade did about his exercise, and he said that he always likes to start training on 8, which fits within the range that you've suggested as well. And it's something that we try and stick to. But yeah, it's the food that you eat before. So if my son has just eaten a big bowl of chocolate cereal, that's a nightmare before football, because of course you're going to get the big spike. So we try and have the egg on toast and Greek yogurt with fruit or something like that, in an ideal world.
I think, those kind of things, but it's not going to happen every day.
No.
So
yeah, that's true. Alison has asked, is the training course still available, the one you referred to at the beginning? Is that something?
So it's in development is the answer. So they've done a trial of the training course for adults, and I think the plan is to roll that out a bit wider. It's just in the process of looking for funding, and I'm pretty sure they've got funding to develop one for children and young people as well.
Great. Okay. What extra considerations, Glyn has asked, are there for people who haven't done much exercise but want to start doing a bit more?
So that's a really, really good question. There's kind of 3 things I'd say right off the bat, which are: be realistic. So we've probably all got a memory of when we were at our fittest and think we can go back to that. And it turns out that that's not always the case. So be realistic with your expectations, and we have to manage ourselves. So start slowly and start gently. What I mean by that is, you go for relatively short periods of time and do relatively low intensity activity, and then you can build up the time and the intensity of the activity. As people get older, we do need to think about sort of complications and things like that. So, if you're getting pain or discomfort in the chest, then seek help. If you're getting any kind of foot problems, then seek help. And actually, if you retinopathy, if you're needing active treatment, then it's worth getting things actively treated before you do high intensity activity. So there's some kind of considerations there in terms of safety, but I think for the majority of particularly young people, where it's more about building up kind of strength and confidence and things like that, start slowly, start gently, and actually what you find is as you become fitter, the impact is less rather than more.
Fantastic, thank you. Katie's asking, should insulin reduction be based on percentage? I think that's what you had in your slides, or actual carbs consumed, depending on the size of the meal or snack. A percentage reduction could vary quite considerably.
It could, but we tend to start with percentages anyway. I mean, I think, I guess we're not expecting the highest carb kind of consumption relatively close to activity, but we would generally start with a percentage, and then that percentage will generally be effective, because remember, it's about the increase in sensitivity. So it's about the adjustment in terms of how much you need in terms of sensitivity a lot of the time. So that's why we use percentages rather than absolute amounts. I think it's a really astute question, but that's why we use percentages rather than absolute amounts.
Okay, thank you. Jenny's asking, what about adrenaline that's making the numbers go up during exercise? How can we adjust for that with food and insulin?
Yeah, so making it go up during exercise and also go up before exercise, wherever possible. The two things I'd always say with adrenaline highs, where they're an option, and this is particularly close beforehand, is keep well hydrated and use that low intensity activity wherever you can to help manage the adrenaline highs. Because actually, if you can avoid using insulin, then that's, it generally makes it a little bit more straightforward. With adrenaline highs during activity, if it's a predictable high or it's one that you've already kind of got to, then if you're expecting your glucose to go up by 4 millimoles per litre, then half of your normal correction dose for the expected rise you can take before the activity, if it's reliable that it goes up. Otherwise, using half of your normal correction dose immediately afterwards has been shown to be safe to bring glucose back into range. I hope that kind of covers.
No, that does. That sounds really good. I personally find my son, when he starts football, his numbers go up, and it's only when he finishes that sort of half an hour after his numbers will come down again. So that's when we'll sort of be giving him food after. Do you have any advice for insulin adjustment for patients on a closed loop pump?
Closed loops they're absolutely fantastic. So what I would say is the companies will tell you, not unreasonably, you can just use their exercise settings, and you don't have to do it. You always tell the system exactly how many carbs you're having. I think that's not entirely true. So they work really well if you use the sort of eased off settings, and the different closed loop systems have different kind of names and ways that they manage that. But if you use the eased off kind of settings, a couple of hours, after a meal, so once the mealtime insulin is out of the system, if you're exercising within 2 hours of a meal, then we talked about reducing the bolus by 50%. I don't think you need to reduce bolus by that much, but actually knocking 20 or 30%. And the way you have to do that with these systems is knocking 20 to 30% off the carbs that you tell them that you're having, and then using the kind of announcement of activity. So the kind of less intense setting, the kind of ease off type settings. So same as you would if you were changing the pump normally, you want to set those in kind of 90 to 120 minutes beforehand. And if you're having a meal within 2 hours before the exercise, maybe 20 to 30% less carbs than you're actually having.
Thank you. Now, I've just realised the time. I'm so sorry, we've overrun a bit.
Oh, sorry.
We're going to need to wrap up for you because I know you've got another session in 10 minutes.
Yes.
Very, very quickly, Maureen's asked, would snowboarding be a high intensity sport? So is that going to be the one that the anaerobic?
So that's a really good question. I suspect so. Being at altitude can actually increase your insulin requirement, but
yes,
the kind of overall level of activity at altitude will generally decrease your insulin requirement. And I would suspect that snowboarding in general is going to be a drop in blood glucose, but maybe not as intense as, you know, if you were just running steadily. So it will be a slow drop in blood glucose, but what you'll then see, because there's an element of adrenaline in that, afterwards, you might see quite a rapid drop off in glucose afterwards.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I can see from all the interaction that we've had in the chat, Alistair, this session has really been appreciated, and I found it absolutely brilliant. So thank you so much.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for having me. It's been a real pleasure and an honour. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.